From time immemorial, the sovereign nations have inhabited, protected, and preserved the land that is so-called Canada. We acknowledge this fact. The land we serve is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, and the Chippewa. Real World's offices are in Toronto, which is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit.
Hello and welcome. My name is Charnel Anderson. I'm a journalist with TVO.org. I'm of Anishinaabe and European descent. I'm a member of Kiashkizoging Anishinaabeg here in Northwestern Ontario. And I'm here today with Jennifer Podemski, an award-winning film and television producer and actor, and the recipient of this year's Real World Award of Excellence. Hello and congratulations.
Thank you. Hello.
It's nice to finally meet you. So your credits include, but are not limited to, films like Empire of Dirt and Dance Me Outside, and television shows like Degrassi, The Next Generation, The Res, and Reservation Dogs. What initially drew you to film and television?
Oh my goodness, that is such a loaded question. I was very into performing arts as a child. It was something that I feel was kind of an outlet for me during a tumultuous kind of childhood. So I really was able to express myself and my feelings when I was singing or dancing and performing and that sort of thing. And I just happened to go to an elementary school where we had a lot of those programs available in Toronto. So my passion really started with the performing arts. So I really pursued a career as a dancer. I was just very much all about becoming a professional dancer. And I went to a performing arts high school, which is a very sort of elite program for performing arts, dance, music, art, visual arts, and drama. So when I was at the school, I sort of had the flicker of interest to focus more on drama and acting. And so I did that, and my passion for theater grew, and I guess I got accepted. I was auditioning for a background performing role in a movie, I think, or a TV series when I was 16, and I got chosen. And that's really where my passion began. It was accidentally on the set of a series called 9B, and it was as a background performer. And I was like, I think I don't want to be a dancer anymore. I want to be an actor. And there was one Indigenous woman on that show named Michelle St. John, who I was already in love with from Where the Spirit Lives, which had been like a really big movie about residential school. And I had always kind of admired her. So that was really where the flicker began. And then I just launched into my full on acting career. It was very, very challenging as looking the way I do and only auditioning for native roles, which were few and far between for many years, which ultimately led me to say I have to open my own production company by the time I was 25, because the industry just continued and perpetually sucked for Indigenous people. And I just couldn't deal with it anymore.
Right. Yeah. And I want to ask you about your production company, but first I'm wondering if you can kind of take us through your early years in the industry.
Um, my early years, well, I started auditioning. I mean, I'm from Toronto, born and raised in Toronto, so that was sort of uh, my pool of work was really Toronto focused. So I would do a lot of auditions in Toronto when available. So it was mostly, going to school, going to dance. It was a very demanding program that I was in at the Performing Arts High School. So my whole life was really about performing. It was extracurricular dance, shows, performances at school, class, curriculum, all of those things, plus auditioning whenever I could. My experience auditioning was really interesting at the time because I was kind of like the only native kid, and I'm half native, so it's like I had this Jewish dad and native mom. I was very different, and I was the only one like me at all the schools I went to. So auditioning for roles that were for someone like me, in many ways, opened up a pathway of releasing shame about being Native, I think, for me. So my work and the work in the industry, although usually pretty stereotypical and often not really well done, in many ways helped to support my journey to recover from, shame around growing up Native in Toronto. So, those early years were really very much about trying to book gigs, and it was very, very hard to book a gig at the time. I got a bunch of little roles here and there. Like my big role that I got when I was 18 was the Diviners, and then from there it sort of blossomed into bigger and better things. Booking Dance Me Outside was really the feature film kind of debut that a career needs to catapult it to the next level. That was when I was, I think, 21. And then that turned into a TV series, The Res. Those were two really significant and important experiences in my life. It taught me a lot about what needed to change in terms of Indigenous representation on screen. Not that they were doing necessarily anything wrong. I think that show and that film were very progressive for its time, for what we were allowed to do. The most important thing was that stuff put us on camera and put us on film. And from that point on, I couldn't go back, and everything else was just very one dimensional, I found. So my young career as an actor only really lasted, a good, I don't know, 7 years before I just said, I can't really do this anymore. I just can't continue to play these roles that are either, sexualizing Indigenous women or watching Indigenous women be harmed, or traumatized. And that was just the selection of roles at the time. I was very, very lucky, though. I had an agent who really pushed the boundaries in a way that I had not seen anyone do, and didn't. I don't know a lot of people who do this, but my agent sort of forced me on casting directors and producers, to a point where I would be in rooms with all white girls, like, who did not look like me, blonde hair, blue eyes, and I was auditioning for, like, the cashier or the, whatever, the one day player, just to get in there and be seen and be considered. And although it was very overwhelming, and I felt very insecure about being in those rooms, I knew how important it was for me to be there. And eventually I started booking roles that on the casting breakdown, it actually said blonde hair, blue eyes. So in my early 20s, that was sort of the thing that started happening. And I was really, really lucky to be able to be supported in that way by my agent, and then ultimately book roles that were not made for Native characters, and really, like, kind of spread out my experience to include a wider range of characters, but still to the point where by the time I was 25, and I had already moved to New York to kind of pursue a different career. I wasn't really sure. I went to New York to kind of find myself. That's when I booked a series called Riverdale, which again I was fulfilling a role of a character who was a Caucasian character. She went into a coma and woke up as me. So yes, the audience and fans, I think, were kind of upset about that, but it also did plant me in a sort of level of my career where I was being seen as something then other than only a Native actress. And that was a significant turning point. It also gave me the opportunity to really build out my idea for how I would run my own production company and make my own shows. that was just the time when I was shooting Riverdale that all of that happened.
Right. Yeah. And so you said you were in your 20s when you teamed up with Laura Milliken to open the first Indigenous owned and operated production company in Canada, Big Soul Productions. Um,
Mhm.
what made you want to move behind the camera?
It's just things weren't moving fast enough for me. Like it was, to me, it felt like a very dire situation for Indigenous storytellers, and I couldn't shake this feeling of anger and rage around like getting these scripts sent to me that had these native characters and storylines, and like it was about us and about people like my family and things that we've gone through, and every single thing that I ever saw was written by non-native people, and every single thing I did was directed by non-native people, produced. And after, I would say, a good 5 years of really hardcore giving it all I had, to work, once every, just because I had celebrity didn't mean that I was always working as an actor. I still had like 2 or 3 full-time jobs elsewhere. I was traveling the country doing workshops and training youth. And I just, all of it sort of came to a head where I was just like, this is not going to end well if I continue to do this. So it just couldn't have happened any other way. Like I moved behind the camera out of necessity for I don't know, this I guess I just realized like I'm never just going to be an actor. It's not going to work that way for me, because I I have I have too much to say about what's wrong with the industry, and you're not going to be able to fix what's wrong if you're in front of the camera on other people's projects. The only way to really change the system is to do it yourself. Get on the inside of the system and do it yourself.
I'm wondering if you can say more about how that transition was for you from an actor to a producer.
It was very much trial by error. I spoke to a lot of people who stepped forward as mentors for me, just to figure out how to do it all, because it's very complicated, right? To make, not just to make content, but to run a production company and to manage people and all of the things that come along with all of that, responsibility. um I would just say it was trial by fire. It was very, very difficult. It was a lot, many years of like ridiculous long days, like 16, 17 hours. It was really hard. It was building a business. It was building capacity. It was trying to maintain a career that would subsidize this production company that I was trying to create. Um, but at the same time, it was a very special time, because it was the same moment in time that APTN launched, that Imaginative launched. It was all literally at the same time by accident. So I guess I realized that we weren't alone at that time. There weren't a lot of people doing really what we were doing, but we weren't alone in the industry. It was still very lonely, and it was still an uphill battle most of the time. And our first license fee for my first show, The Seventh Generation, was, I think, I don't even know, $300 an episode, something like that. I think it was, in total, it was like a $3,000 license, and then we had to find the rest of the hundreds of thousands of dollars. So you just get very, very innovative with, how do we make money? How do we raise money to make this show?
And I'm wondering, how did you do that?
Well, my first show was called The Seventh Generation, and it was at the time what we called an Aboriginal youth role model series. And the whole vision was really to create a TV series, like with Indigenous people who tell their stories of triumph. And when we realize like that it's going to cost, you know, a certain amount of money to do this, even if we drove across the country and even if we owned our own equipment and even if we filmed it ourselves, it would still cost money to do it. So what we ended up doing is essentially pitching federal departments that would sponsor an episode of a particular kind of career that we were looking into. Because what we were finding was, oh, well, there's a bunch of lawyers, or there's a few doctors, or there's a corrections officer, or there's an outreach worker. And you start to look at federal departments, not from their funding streams, but from their communications teams, you know, people who put a little bit of money into marketing to, you know, Corrections Canada or Justice Canada. And actually, that was our funding model at the time. We were able to get little sponsorships from different organizations, and say we did an episode on someone who was a corrections officer and has overcome incredible things and done amazing things with their life, and someone who's working, you know, who's an ex offender who was stuck in the justice system and now is working, you know, with puppetry with kids. Like an episode like that feels like it could really be sponsored by someone who cares about that kind of thing. So that's really what we did. And we did it for very, very little money. We drove everywhere. We almost never flew, except if it was to Nunavut or, you know, far away in the Arctic. Um, and I remember faxing and calling. I would be on the phone like all day, every day until we would get free car rentals. We would basically, you know, we couldn't afford to rent cars. We couldn't afford to stay in hotels. So we stayed in the grimiest, most disgusting hotels across the country in every place we went to, because those were the ones that were agreeing to give us 4 nights or 5 nights for a credit on the show. So it's just it's not very different than how we do it today. It's just, you know, working with a lot less money and fewer resources. So it was an interesting time, but I can tell you that when you make things yourself, you learn so much and the lessons are long lasting.
I bet. I mean, it sounds like, you know, a lot of creativity and resourcefulness has, you know, been needed
Totally.
for.
It's all innovation.
Yeah. Um, and so I want to talk about Indigenous representation in the arts, because you've been, you know, doing this work for over 30 years. How has Indigenous representation in the industry evolved since when you started out?
Um well, it's evolved significantly. I don't know if it's quite where I had imagined it being, you know, when I was starting out. Whatever, 25 years ago, you know, is when I really opened Big Soul. Um, but what is different is there would be times where I would, you know, I would be the only Indigenous person in the room, or there would be 2 of us at like an event like the Gemini Awards or the Junos, not the Junos, the whatever they were at the time, the movie awards, and the Genies, that's what it was called. Um, and that's very different now. I mean, there's massive groups of creators, Indigenous people, lots of diversity. You know, that's the thing that really sucked a lot, was for a lot of time there people were just calling me about everything. And it's like, don't you have other people to call? Like, can't there be someone else to do this interview? Because I can't just be doing all the interviews. Like, I'm not the only Native person around. There's lots of us, and there are lots of different diverse cultures, and this is not cool. So it's evolved to the point where it holds its own across the sector. We hold our own.
I'm curious about, you know, you said you had maybe imagined it differently. I'm wondering if you can tell me about that.
Well, I guess I imagined that there's a level of control that allows for Indigenous stories to reach wider audiences without being filtered through the lens of non-Indigenous stakeholders. I did at one point imagine that we would have, you know, lots of people in charge. more broadcasters and more distributors and just across the board. But 25 years later, after the original sort of imagining of how things could be, I think we've just really scratched the surface of that.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if that's something that you see changing into the future.
I think so. I do. One thing I have recognized is that the screen sector, media, communications, it's only, one small piece of the larger puzzle, which is the representation across all sectors. So I really feel like film and television and the arts and media and communications will have a bigger and farther reach in terms of our content, our accessibility, our opportunities, our platforms, our audiences, at the same pace as sectors like education or justice or child welfare uh, expand into being controlled more by Indigenous people. I think they are a lot more similar than different, and that's one thing that's really unique about, I guess, just the I can't speak for everybody, but I think it is unique to Indigenous people that we are often like we're working within a structure that was designed to kind of shut us out. So until other sectors become more inclusive and more um, and provide more opportunities for Indigenous engagement and collaboration and partnership, I don't think the film or a screen sector can really get there faster because they're so interconnected.
I'm curious because it sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong, but there was, a fair amount of typecasting when you started out for Indigenous women in the industry. And I'm curious if you feel that there are more opportunities now available for Indigenous peoples than, when you had started out.
I think there are more more opportunities. I think that, of course, with reservation dogs, that sort of opened up like the world a lot for us. But we still need to, like, it's just not. It's so at the beginning stages because the majority of the industry still thinks it's okay for non-Indigenous people to make Indigenous stories and tell Indigenous stories. And that's just simply not okay. And the fact that that still happens is a sign that, we still have a long way to go. And a lot of people don't necessarily understand the repercussions of that. Um, but there are repercussions, and the repercussions are that, we continue to be shut out.
Yeah, can we talk about that? Why it's important for Indigenous peoples to be telling Indigenous stories as opposed to a non-Indigenous person telling the same story.
Well, I think there's a few things. We are in I think a time of reckoning, when it comes to the kinds of stories the community at large, the communities want to tell. And many of those stories have this sort of reclamation element to them, which makes sense because the stories that we know about ourselves through media and the stories that society knows about us through the media. I'm not talking about oral history or family stories or collective knowledge or anything like that, or community stories. I'm talking about, popular media um, that has been created and disseminated across whatever 100 and something years, was essentially propaganda at the beginning, propaganda to make Indigenous people the bad guy, and to create excitement and ownership for, settlers and settler colonial kind of ideals and consciousness, to feel like this is where, where they can be, and where they can belong. So a lot of the work that's happening in terms of storytelling, and when you look back to, our forefathers, like filmmakers like Alan Bonsawin, or I mean, there's so many, a handful of people who were telling stories from the beginning, 30, 40 years ago, were telling stories about things that happened in history in a way that were not told properly. So I think we're still in the phase where we're trying to tell the stories properly, so that we can reclaim the authentic versions of those stories from the authentic people that those stories come from, and showcase the diversity and variety of Indigenous voices across Turtle Island, while at the same time imagining ourselves and our communities into the future, so that we stop being erased, and we no one is going to include us unless we include ourselves. So it's up to us to include ourselves, but it's up to the industry to recognize that in order to sort of repair the current paradigm, which is, the thing, everything we see in textbooks is not necessarily true. It's just a version of history told through the colonial lens. That's the same with film and television. Almost everything to date has been a version of a specific story, saying something that might impact Indigenous people or Indigenous communities, or the way people think about Indigenous people, through the lens, distilled through the lens of, you know, the a non-Indigenous person for entertainment purposes. So we're kind of doing a bunch of things at the same time. We're reclaiming and we're reimagining, and storytelling is a great way to do that. Journalism is a part of that. Literature is a part of that. But in order to get to a place where we're like really just having fun, like a lot of other people get to just have fun, not to say that that doesn't happen, because it does, but there's always an element of taking something back. Some people say, many people, we all say land back. And, I think that for what we do in the screen sector, it's, screen back. It's like image back.
Right.
Stories back.
I'm curious about, how this dynamic, between, well, yeah, just the storytelling of Indigenous stories from non-Indigenous people, to kind of the shift that we're seeing now, just how that dynamic has, impacted your career and, kind of your career path.
There's just been a lot of, like, on a personal level and a relationship level, a lot of like not good situations that I've had with people who really were just using me and my access to funding, let's say, for Indigenous stories, or the opportunity that, a platform like APTN provided, not being recognized, that I was being used for that by seemingly well-meaning partners. That has been a big repercussion of the industry sort of moving the needle a little bit more to include Indigenous stories. But what happens is then you have all these non-Indigenous producers looking for Indigenous partners, really, in my case, too many times, to take advantage of that person and do it their own way and not acknowledge Indigenous leadership. So I feel like I'm out of that now, but I know that it still exists and it's still a problem, people preying on us and our platforms and uh our accessibility to potential financing that is directed at Indigenous people and creators. There's always going to be people who are like the sharks, They're swirling around you and they want a piece of it. It's hard to know who to trust, and it's hard to know who's a mentor and who is a good partner. But I think that's all part of the process. I think it's very similar to just, you know, every day, making choices every day of who you want to spend your time with and who you want to get into relationships with, and how to be safe and how to protect yourself. I think that there are many ways that we can protect people. I think that the real onus has to be on the non-indigenous production industry, and that it probably is the same for other creators of color and diverse backgrounds, where, you know, when there is a story to tell that has any kind of culturally specific lens, then that the agency to tell that story should be on the person who is of that culture and lived experience, regardless if a non-indigenous partner thinks that it's a good story or a good structure. Or yeah, I think it's a very delicate balance, which, in my not-for-profit life, why I started the Shine Network, which is sort of an advocacy body to help build capacity and protect spaces that we occupy in the screen sector. One of the things I'm working on is a course that I hope everybody will take, but um, it's really designed for non-indigenous stakeholders and partners in the industry to take the course and ultimately get a certificate that says, I took this course and now I understand a little bit more of why it's important to let this indigenous partner lead this process. Or, I know how important it is I know what a safe space looks like, or I know what collaboration looks like. I know what an indigenous led process looks like. Like, I'm taking one step in the direction of, you know, dismantling the structural racism within the industry that is inherent in, across all sectors, but in the film industry specifically, because we literally are trying to take back what has been taken from us, which is those stories and those voices and that image, and everything we think about in terms of imagery and who we are has had an impact on the Canadian or American or global consciousness, and most of it is untrue and inauthentic. So you can't help. I never really felt like I could really do the change that I so desire in the industry after 30 years of being in the industry, and then realizing that maybe it's a not-for-profit organization that can really act as an advocacy body that does the active outreach and higher level kind of uh, capacity building to ensure that we're maybe making a little bit of a difference to make safer spaces, and ultimately pipelines to opportunities that wouldn't otherwise exist because people just don't think about us in that way. So it's really all connected. I always knew that I was a performer, but sometimes the version or the way that your gift presents is not exactly the way that you imagined it. It's still the gift, but it's just being presented in an entirely different way.
I smiled there a little bit when you mentioned the Shine Network Institute, because that was going to be my next question. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the Shine Institute, the Shine Network Institute, and what its purpose is.
So the Shine Network Institute is what was really my call to action to address these systemic issues within the screen sector, specifically for Indigenous women, because I know for myself and my own experiences that I have, at the time when I started the Shine Network, really had very difficult situations with non-Indigenous partners. Very, very difficult, to the point where I wondered if it was even worth it to continue, because it was just too difficult. And I had one very, very, very unfortunate situation that ended up with, you know, with me seeking legal counsel and trying to address it legally, and really recognizing that I had no rights. And so I started digging around, trying to find like help. And I called, the Indigenous Screen Office, obviously, and they're not really built for that. I got great advice and great help, but ultimately, I just couldn't find anywhere that was for Indigenous women in the screen sector. So I called my friend who had recently left the corporate world, and I said, "Do you think you could help me build a not for profit? Because there's a need here, and I want to make this like the next thing that I do and focus on." I I think that if we had a body or an organization that was dedicated to supporting Indigenous women in the sector, that everybody will benefit from it. Because when women, in a matriarchal sense, and how, historically our communities worked, or my community anyways, um, was that, when the women are at the center and helping the community navigate, the community works in a healthy way. So that's sort of the idea behind the Shine Network. It's really for everyone to benefit, but led by Indigenous women, and nurturing processes that are led by Indigenous women.
And so you also do training and mentoring with Indigenous youth. I'm wondering what advice you have for those with burgeoning careers in the film and television world.
Um, that's a really good one, because there's so much advice. Um, I the thing that I often experience is that people in general want things to happen fast. And that's not how this business works at all. It is like a big, big commitment. My Google is talking without anyone there. My so my best advice would be to prepare for the long haul. It's not about taking one course or doing one episode of a show or getting auditions. It's like a holistic approach. So if you have the desire to be a part of this industry, start small, be background on a show if you can. That is the best way to get into the industry, because then you get to watch from an amazing vantage point everybody work. And it's a great access point, I think. There's so much training around. If you live in an urban center, it's easier to get the training you need. But I would say, it really is about training and workshops, and just seek it out, search it out. And in terms of performing and producing and directing, those are all things that you can do in the comfort of your own home. I was the kid who always put shows on, whether I was in elementary school or at summer camp or high school, or just even with, on Christmas holidays with my friends. I was always making stuff. And that becomes like your experience. You learn how to make things with people and work with people and create something together by practicing.
I'm curious if you could go back and talk to your younger self who was just starting out in your career, what kind of advice or guidance that you would have for yourself.
You know, so much of what we do in life is interconnected to where we are, in relation to, let's say, our trauma, for example. So in my own healing process, I think that I had so much to heal from by the time I started, building a career. And many of my choices were made out of fear and maybe not feeling good enough. So if I could go back, it wouldn't be anything career focused. It would be like, deal with this thing right now, because if you don't deal with it now, in 10 years, it's going to bite you in the ass and it's going to mess up your career. It's going to mess up your life. And it's going to take you a long time to recover. So it would be, yes, this happened to you, Jen. And yes, that's shitty. But if you really want to change the world and make the world a better place and change the way the industry works, then you have to focus on you first. Heal yourself as badly as you want to heal the community. Heal yourself.
Sage advice. Finally, I just want to ask what you have in store for the future.
Well, I'm about to finish my mini series called Little Bird. That is Crave's first drama series. I believe it will be out in next year sometime, 2023, in Canada on Crave and APTN. And currently, the distributors are seeking partnerships across the globe. But that is a very important show to me. Worked on it for many years, and we're just in the final phases of post-production right now. Little Bird is a 6-part miniseries about one woman's journey from being abducted from her home in the 1960s through a program in Saskatchewan during the 60s scoop, and her journey in her 20s finding her way back home to her community. So it was a challenging, re-traumatizing project to make, but I think that it's a very important story and ultimately very uplifting story, and I'm very excited about it because I had Zoe Hopkins and Elmaya Tailfeathers at the helm as directors, myself as showrunner, and it really feels like an authentic Indigenous voice to me, and I'm really, really proud of that.
It's very exciting.
And the rest I can't share because it's not real yet.
Sounds good. Well, we'll have to keep an eye out for that. That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Jennifer. And congratulations again on your achievement as the winner of this year's Real World Award of Excellence.
Thank you.